This venue cannot be matched, but I want to bring attention to a couple of the pieces of furniture. We borrowed these columns, what are they called? Lectern? No.
What?
Pedestals.
Pedestal.
From Elk River Lodge number 35, our host lodge. They've got to be 100 years old. Nobody can tell me how old they are.
They're awesome. 1899.
1890.
Perfect. So they're 126 years old. The candlesticks that are forming the lesser lights, those came from Kootenay chapter number 3 of the Royal Arch, which was in Kaslo from the 1890s until the early 2000s. So they're 120 years old. The other items of furniture were also from Elk River. That Tyler's sword is from the 1890s. It was a Rosicrucian sword.
Knights Templar.
Knights Templar, sorry, thank you.
These are
Talk about yourself, Tyler.
Yeah, I can talk about myself. All right. Well, I live in Kaslo with my spouse, Nicole. We have 3 children. Their ages are 15, 18, and 21. I've been involved in information technology through my whole career. I currently work for Kootenay Savings Credit Union. I was initiated into Freemasonry in 2011 in Kaslo and passed and raised in 2012. I served as the worshipful master of that lodge for 4 years, 2018 to 2022, and I've been the lodge secretary ever since. I have been the worshipful master of the Kootenay Lodge of Education and Research since its inception in 2023, as Right Worshipful Brother Trowell mentioned. And I'm going to give you a little talk now about, the lead-in is about our ritual books, but it's going to go somewhere else from there. So first I'll explain my inspiration for this talk. Our various ritual books over the centuries have varying degrees of obscuring the wording. So the first book of ritual that I studied was, after becoming a Master Mason, was the 1960s and 70s version of the BC Ancient Work. This little black book has a lot of words obscured. So, sometimes several on a page, sometimes several in a paragraph, just the first letter or two of a word. And certain sections are omitted entirely and only transmitted mouth to ear. The more recent printing of this same work is much easier to read. Only a small handful of words and paragraphs are omitted, and otherwise no words are obscured. The former led to quite a bit of confusion, as it was all too easy to mix up a word in the ritual when another, starting with the same letter, would fit in the sentence. The latter is much easier to study. It certainly makes me marvel at the men of the past who learned it entirely by reciting what their instructors were saying to them repeatedly until they got it. Lester's Look to the East, first published in 1876, was basically unabridged, much more than the BC publications of the ancient work. It contains the penalties of our obligations, all spelled out in black and white, even the explanation of the 5 points of fellowship, everything but the passwords, grips, and signs. In a similar vein, in the library of the Kaslo Lodge Hall, which has been in use since 1897, I found a copy of Illustrated Freemasonry, dated 1903, which contained not only the 3 craft degrees of ancient and American ritual, but also the degrees of the Holy Royal Arch. Every gesture with a diagram, every handshake, every password. It was written by an anti-Mason and contains some of his commentary. I've been told by a very reliable source who was present this weekend that many Masons of the 20th century would use such exposés as study guides. Anyone well versed in it could verify the accuracy of the ritual found therein. At the other end of the spectrum, I was gifted on 2 separate occasions 2 copies of a very peculiar ritual book. It's the same ancient work form of our ritual, but every single word was obscured, represented by a letter or two. A student would need to know the work by heart and just use this as prompts. The one with the printing date of 1898 is in much better shape than the one from 1916. That one came from Gordon Webb, who made Caslow's working tools. The title, Esse Orienti, translates from Latin to Behold the East. That sounds familiar. Look to the east. During the late 1800s, many U.S. Masonic Grand Lodges strictly banned printing or writing down lodge rituals in plain text to protect our fraternal secrets. To circumvent this and provide a memory aid for officers learning their roles, this book was written and published, but under a somewhat elaborate disguise. What was even more peculiar about this volume, besides the cipher, was the introduction. It purported to be the ritual of the ancient order of the Essenes. The 10-page introduction described their secretive sect, and many things it said were describing Freemasonry to a T. Now, was this just a cover story to obscure what it really was? Or was there in fact any similarities or connections between Freemasonry and this Jewish religious community from 2 millennia ago, as this book's preface and introduction claimed? This question is what got me curious enough to do some digging, and that's what the rest of this paper will be about. As I started to do some research, I uncovered a paper from none other than Mackey, author of the most prominent encyclopedia of Freemasonry, criticizing the assertions of the author of A History of Freemasonry, who was either Alexander Lowry or Sir David Brewster. Sir David Brewster was a Scottish scientist and inventor of the kaleidoscope. Lowry was the publisher and the credited author, and Brewster was the ghost or actual writer. Brewster was hired by Lowry to compile and write it, and he did all of the academic heavy lifting. We will call it Lowry's history, but it was authored by Brewster. In any question of history, it is nice to find one historian criticizing another to hear two sides of an argument. But the dead one didn't have a chance for rebuttal on the question of whether the Essenes had influence on Freemasonry. Lowry's history of 1804 was making the case that the Essenes did indeed have a direct connection with our modern craft. Mackey posited that many of the similarities are true of all secret societies and mystery schools through the ages, such as modes of recognition. He also shot down each of the several arguments made by the elder scholar to try and support his belief that the Essenes had a connective lineage back to the workers in the First Temple and ahead to modern Freemasonry. For one example, Brewster was trying to make the case that a piece of fabric was sacred to them and liken that to our aprons. But this cloth was part of their daily bathing ritual, as they believed in a daily baptism. So perhaps this was more of a sacred washcloth than an apron. Still, the white was to symbolize purity of heart and regularity of conduct. Here are a few more of the points and counterpoints. Prior to admission, a strict investigation into the candidate's character was done to see that he was capable of curbing his passions and regulate his conduct according to the virtues encouraged by the order. Well, of course. Wouldn't that be the case for any group, especially one based on morality? And then the point of elders instructing the youth. Well, that's just the natural order of things. Mackey points out that Brewster may well have said, like all other sects. Elders, they admitted no women. Brewster uses this point of common identity, but Mackey shuts this down as a rule common to all masculine associations. He says it might distinguish them from other religious sects, but that point alone doesn't therefore liken them to Freemasons. They had a solemn oath of secrecy, but again, that is very common of secret orders. Otherwise, their secrets wouldn't stay secret. Brewster makes the claim that their signs of recognition were similar, but Mackey says this is mere assumption, arguing that having signs of mutual recognition has been the custom of all secret societies through the ages. The only sign that bore resemblance was one akin to our sign of fidelity, one of the few that we do in public, with right hand over left breast. But it wasn't a mode of recognition so much as a posture assumed during prayer at their daily assemblies, a fairly common gesture. They had places of retirement where they practiced their rites and settled the affairs of the society. And that after the performance of these duties, they assembled in a large hall where entertainment and provisions were provided. Mackey dismisses this as just the common meal held at the end of the day of labor, as part of any usual habitation. At their initiation, they were presented with a white garment or robe, and it was accompanied by an apron and a spade. The spade was certainly not a trowel and was employed to serve a very practical purpose, as this was before modern plumbing. Mackey was more graphic in his explanation. The fact that their teachings and rituals did not involve any symbolism from the building trade was one of Mackey's main arguments against the influence of one on the other. It is acknowledged by Lowry's history, but Mackey believes this point to be fatal to the argument of a solid link. Brewster seeks to connect the Essenes and the builders of Solomon's temple via the Assyrians, but Mackey counters that the Assyrians were not of an older date than the Essenes, and like them, were removed from the time of the building of the Solomonic temple by 8 centuries. So Mackey's conclusion, and I quote, "The truth is that the Essenes and the Freemasons derive whatever similarity or resemblance they may have from that spirit of brotherhood which has prevailed in all ages of the civilized world, the inherent principles of which, as the natural results of any fraternization, where all the members are engaged in the same pursuit and governed by one common bond of unity, are brotherly love, charity, and generally that secrecy and exclusiveness which secures them to them an isolation in the practice of their rites from the rest of the world. And hence, between all fraternities, ancient and modern, these remarkable coincidences will be apt to be found." Unquote. Now back to the Isi Orienti, the rites and ceremonies of the Essenes. What were the claims of the introduction of this book? Well, there were 3 grades or ranks. This part is true. A full year was spent between each degree and prior to initiation. Their obligation: piety toward God, justice toward men, to shun the wicked, to emulate the good, to show fidelity and obedience to those in authority, to be a lover of truth and a reprover of falsehood, to keep hands clean from theft and his soul from unlawful gains, to conceal nothing from the order, nor disclose any secrets to anyone in any manner other than that he received them himself, and to carefully guard and preserve the sacred books and symbols. This is a broad generalization and omits many specifics, but it highlights the parallels. It certainly omits the parts that don't fit the narrative. There are certainly a lot of winks and nods to things straight out of our rituals. Another example is a reference to the 24-inch gauge, one of our entered apprentice working tools. It says they divided the 24 hours into 3 parts: a portion for service to God and the relief of the needy and distressed, a portion for their usual avocations, and a portion for refreshment and sleep. One interesting item: the only words changed in the ritual, that is Black Sabbath the Wizard, and it's very, very distinctive because no matter what the din is in the background, you can hear that harmonica and not miss it. Apologies for the interruption. So the only words changed in the ritual were those of the worshipful master, the senior warden, and the junior warden, instead calling them Rabban, which is Hebrew for master, Rabbi for teacher, and Rab, assistant teacher. Also, it used the word Hadoth instead of lodge, which is Hebrew for secret meeting place. The bottom line: this is all just a clever subterfuge. It claims to be an outline of the ancient mystical teachings of the Essenes, an ascetic Jewish sect from the Second Temple period. However, this framing is entirely a cover story. And in fact, the book is actually a complete expose or memory aid for standard Masonic Lodge rituals, the same work as Leicester's look to the east. Still, much of what is stated is accurate, even if embellishments are mixed in. I leave it open to your imagination whether there is an unbroken thread tying and connecting the two, or if these are mere interesting similarities. Now, a few more notes about the Essenes. Who were they? They were scholars, scribes, monks, and ascetic celibates. So members were recruited from the Jewish communities in which they lived. People were not born into it. They joined of their own volition. They held all funds in common and had stewards take care of their needs. They ate common meals and avoided communication outside their order. They got up before sunrise and sang a hymn of praise for the return of light, which they did with their faces turned to the east. They were believers in prophecies of an Armageddon, a final battle between light and dark. And around the turn of the millennia, Jews were expected to align themselves with one of the sects in Judea at the time, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, or the Essenes. The Essenes were not Hebrews obsessed with the temple like the Sadducees were, but rather were alienated from it and considered it corrupted. All of these sects followed Mosaic law, the law of Moses. Well, obviously, that's the foundation of the Jewish religion. The Pharisees cared deeply about temple law and built a religious system not dependent on the temple. Since we're talking about the time of the Second Temple's physical existence in Jerusalem, which was 516 BCE to 70 CE, the Essenes' rejection of it is significant. They saw themselves as a community forming a spiritual temple and imagined a future perfect temple described in precise specification in the 1st century temple scroll, which was found in Qumran in 1949, along with the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I can't talk about the Essenes without bringing up the Dead Sea Scrolls, since these are the author of those. The Essenes were a community of scribes. They were fanatically copying all of the ancient texts and preserving them. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1949 and date from this time period. The Essenes were active from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century Common Era. Most people have heard about these scrolls, but only a curious few know the details. As well as the traditional biblical texts, including those which are apocryphal and rare due to their rejection by the Catholic and Protestant churches, these scrolls also contained unique writings specific to Essene culture, community texts describing the beliefs, rules, and organization of the group, and texts from other cultures. There were apocalyptic prophecies, books of wisdom, as well as commentaries on scripture. There were texts from other traditions that had been preserved by the sect and that had previously only been seen in different translations. The Essene texts were mostly in Aramaic, and there were some entirely new works not seen before. The Book of Enoch, previously only seen as part of the Ethiopian Bible, and the Book of Jubilees, which is a complete retelling of the stories of Genesis and Exodus. Altogether, the scrolls were a collection of 800 Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek manuscripts. The Essenes faded out of history as Christianity took hold, so perhaps they were early adopters. Some have suggested that Christ himself was an initiate, since the Gospels contain criticisms of the other two sects, but hardly a mention of the Essene. But this would be hard to believe, since he was not an ascetic monk. The more likely case is that John the Baptist may have come from an Essene background. Now, many want to romanticize connections between modern Freemasonry and various ancient and historical traditions, from ancient Egypt to the Templar Knights. Many historians will tell you there isn't much, if any, evidence that the first temple ever existed, or even of King Solomon as a historical figure. But I'm certainly by no means a biblical scholar, and hardly even an amateur armchair historian. So I have no place in engaging in such debates. But there is a spiritual heritage, not a direct lineage, but a cross-pollinating influence and inspiration. Many ancient cultures and empires met and shared ideas, from Persia to Greece, from Africa to Egypt to Europe. When it comes to secret societies and mystery schools, what do they all have in common? Not necessarily a secret truth, but an attitude that certain wisdom is best transmitted through solemn ceremonies. Perhaps we can connect the dots through history like stars in a constellation. They may relate to each other, but rarely go from A to B in a simple, straight line. The Essenes are interesting, but their influence on Freemasonry seems to be that of one among our many spiritual and cultural ancestors through history. Whatever secrets they had, the initiates of the ancient mystery schools have been teaching the same things in different languages, both symbolic and literary. Each mystery school is worthy of a journey down the proverbial rabbit hole to explore their unique character. We find a few common threads, but each have their own symbolism and imagery. I hope you have enjoyed this brief exploration into the Essene sect. The EC Orienti volume is certainly a curiosity of Masonic history. And now, Right Worshipful Brother Trowell.
Worshipful Master,
Yes.
I would like to, I don't know about Assyrians and experience and all those things you said, but
Yeah.
anybody that knew Gordon Webb, you mentioned Gordon Webb,
Yeah. One of these books was his.
God bless Gordon Webb. Anybody that didn't know him, they missed a part of life.
That was passed down to me from Right Worshipful Brother Bill Baird of Weimar Lodge number 31 in Salmo. And it had originally belonged, well, maybe not originally, but had previously belonged to, due to the date. I'm guessing it wasn't his originally.
These long speeches that we've had, there could be a longer speech about Gordon Webb himself. You know,
Brother, could you write that for us and come back next year and present it, please?